I mean, think about it like this. If you walk into a world-class art museum, right, and you stand right up against a massive famous oil painting.
Like one of those big impressionist pieces.
Exactly. You put your nose almost touching the canvas, and you don't actually see a masterpiece. You just see these chaotic, messy blobs of gray and brown and green.
Yeah, you just see the texture of the canvas, maybe some erratic brush strokes.
Right. Maybe even a stray bristle caught in the paint, because you're just far too close to see the giant in front of you. To see the art, to understand what you're actually looking at, you have to take a massive step backward.
You really do.
Welcome to Discipleship for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
And that physical step back in the gallery, well, that's exactly the intellectual and spiritual maneuver we're attempting today.
It really is.
Because we spend our lives so close to our own beliefs, so familiar with the architecture of our own faith, that we often only see those messy blobs of paint.
Oh, 100%. We see the administrative frustrations of a local church or the cultural baggage we grew up with.
Right, the political controversies of the moment, and we just lose the sweeping, staggering reality of the whole picture.
And regaining that picture, that's our mission for this deep dive. For you listening right now, we are acting as thoughtful Christian mentors. We're evaluating a really profound early 20th century piece of Christian apologetics.
G.K. Chesterton's monumental book, The Everlasting Man.
Specifically, focusing on the introduction in part 1. But we aren't just going to summarize his historical arguments like some kind of book report. We are holding Chesterton's brilliant, sweeping, and honestly sometimes chaotic text up to an ultimate standard.
The standard we're calling the master instruction source.
Exactly, because we need a rubric, right? To ensure that brilliant philosophy actually translates into faithful living for you today.
We do. And this master instruction source consists of the 8 core instructions of Jesus for discipleship.
So as we navigate Chesterton's arguments about human history and the nature of God, we're going to measure them against these specific commands.
Which are repentance and faith, self-denial and cross-bearing, total devotion to God's kingdom, humility and service, the law of love, secret obedience, forgiveness, and fruitfulness.
Now, you might be wondering, why are we evaluating a book written in 1925 against the eternal words of Christ, especially for someone who is, currently commuting to work or walking the dog in the 21st century?
Well, because modern discipleship is incredibly difficult right now.
It is. We're navigating this culture that constantly and subtly tries to reduce humanity to mere animals.
Yeah, treating us as just this highly evolved swarm of consumers driven purely by biology and economics.
And simultaneously, that same culture tries to reduce Christianity to just another dusty myth, like a psychological coping mechanism.
Exactly. So this deep dive is designed to give you the intellectual tools to see the world clearly, while challenging you to keep the compassionate, obedient heart of a true disciple.
Right. So before we can evaluate how this text aligns with Jesus, we really have to understand the cognitive shift Chesterton is trying to force on the reader.
Because his primary goal in the opening of The Everlasting Man is to help the reader see Christendom from the outside.
Because he knows that familiarity breeds a kind of blindness, right? A hereditary boredom, I think he calls it.
He does. And he uses this vivid, unforgettable analogy of a boy living in a cottage on a hillside.
Oh, I love this part.
So this boy has lived his whole life on this farm, playing in the garden, wandering the slopes. And one day, he decides to go on a journey to find giants.
As you do when you're a kid.
Right. So he walks for days far away across the valley. And when he finally turns around to look back at his home, he realizes that the slopes he played on are actually the green shapes of a gigantic drawing carved into the chalk of the hill.
He had always lived on a giant, but it was just too large and too close to actually see.
Exactly. It's heavily inspired by those actual ancient geoglyphs in England, like the Uffington White Horse.
Which is this massive prehistoric figure carved into the rolling hills.
Right. When you're standing on the horse's eye, you just see grass and dirt. You have to leave the giant to comprehend the giant.
So Chesterton is arguing that to truly judge the Christian church fairly, we have to make this immense imaginative effort to step completely outside of it.
He says the absolute worst judge of Christianity is the person who is half in and half out.
He describes this person as the ill-educated Christian turning gradually into the ill-tempered agnostic.
Which is such a biting phrase, but it's true. It's the person reacting against the shadow of the faith, frustrated by the rules, but completely losing sight of the brilliant light.
So to shock this kind of person out of their boredom, he recommends this mental exercise that sounds almost absurd.
Yeah, he says these critics should imagine the 12 apostles as Chinamen and judge them as impartially as they would a Chinese pagoda.
Right. He references that legend about the followers of St. Francis Xavier, the Jesuit missionary,
where his converts in the East supposedly depicted the apostles in flowing robes like traditional Chinese sages.
which most Westerners would find scandalous or historically inaccurate. But Chesterton says, actually, that's a brilliant mental tool.
It really is. He's saying, shake off the cloud of mere custom. Stop grumbling about your local bishop or the music at church, and try to view the church as a strange, towering, remote, Asiatic cult that suddenly just appeared in the Roman Empire.
It requires a temporary suspension of everything you take for granted.
Yeah, if you can force your brain to view the central claims that the creator of the universe became a localized human being, died a criminal's death, and physically rose from the dead.
As foreign, bizarre, and entirely new concepts.
Exactly. The sheer magnitude of those claims will shock you all over again. He is trying to reawaken a sense of wonder.
And this desire to reawaken wonder is what drives him to just take aim at the entire secular evolutionary narrative of human history.
Starting right with the popular myth of the caveman.
Let's spend some time in the cave, because this is kind of the foundational argument of the whole book.
It is. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the public was captivated by a really crude version of Darwinian evolution.
Right. They wanted a smooth, uninterrupted slope from an amoeba all the way up to a modern London banker.
And to make that slope work, they needed a missing link. So the cultural imagination basically invented the caveman.
And he was depicted everywhere as this brutal, hunched, grunting half-ape. Right?
Yeah, the assumption was his whole existence revolved around terror and violence. The iconic image is the guy with the heavy brow carrying a massive blood-stained club, dragging a woman into a dark pit.
But Chesterton points out the glaring, embarrassing problem with this narrative. There was absolutely zero physical evidence for it.
Zero.
He notes with so much irony that scientists were intensely interested in everything about the caveman, his jawbone, his skull volume, his theoretical mating habits, except for the one thing he actually did in the cave.
And what primitive humans actually did in those sealed caverns utterly destroys the narrative of the mindless brute.
Because in the late 19th century, in places like Altamira in Spain, people started accidentally discovering these sealed prehistoric caves.
And what did they find when they brought torches into the pitch black? They didn't find a torture chamber.
Or a bloody club.
No, they found soaring, breathtaking art. The walls were covered in these large, sweeping, vibrant outlines of animals.
Stags with massive antlers, reindeer in mid-gallop, drawn with colored earth and charcoal.
Right, and the people who created these images were not mindless brutes operating on instinct. They were artists.
They were naturalists, really, studying the anatomy and movement of these animals.
Chesterton argues this discovery completely disrupts the false twilight of blurry evolutionism. The scientists wanted a twilight where the line between ape and man was indistinguishable.
But Chesterton says the cave paintings represent the stark, bright daylight of human uniqueness.
He points out that the reindeer man could draw, but the reindeer could not.
It sounds so simple, but the philosophical way is staggering. There's that magnificent line where he says, it sounds like a truism to say the most primitive man drew a picture of a monkey.
Right, we can easily picture that.
But it sounds like an absolute joke to say the most intelligent monkey drew a picture of a man.
Exactly. And that joke reveals a profound truth. Art is not just a highly evolved survival mechanism.
Like a beaver building a dam.
Right, a bird building a nest is acting on biological programming. But taking colored dirt and representing a three-dimensional galloping animal on a two-dimensional wall.
That requires abstraction.
It requires the ability to hold an image in your mind when the object isn't there. It requires an appreciation of beauty. Chesterton summarizes this by saying, art is the signature of man.
It's a difference in kind, not degree. But hold on, I want to pause here. I can hear the modern secular pushback loud and clear.
Let's hear it.
A modern evolutionary biologist would say, wait a minute, human consciousness and art did evolve. It was an evolutionary advantage for better communication and hunting coordination. It's still just biology.
Sure, they would say that.
So how does Chesterton's view hold up against that? Is he just dismissing science entirely?
No, he isn't denying the biological realities of human development or the physical similarities between humans and primates. He's fighting what we call reductionism,
Okay, unpack reductionism for us.
Reductionism is the philosophical error of stripping a complex reality down to its lowest common denominator and claiming that's the only truth.
Right.
So if you listen to a soaring Beethoven symphony, a reductionist would say, you are just hearing the friction of horsehair rubbing against sheep gut, sending acoustic vibrations through the air.
Which mechanically is true.
It is completely true physically, but if you claim that is the entirety of what a symphony is, you have entirely missed the reality of the music. Chesterton is arguing that saying human art is just an evolutionary survival mechanism is like saying Beethoven is just acoustic friction. The physical mechanism might be evolutionary, but the reality of the human soul, a mind that mirrors the universe, is a miraculous exception in nature.
That distinction is incredibly helpful. Now, let's bring this back to our master instruction source. Where does this analysis of the caveman align with the way of a disciple?
The alignment is incredibly strong when we look at the instruction of fruitfulness.
Right, Jesus said, by their fruits you shall know them.
Exactly. You don't judge a tree by its bark or its theoretical genetic lineage. You judge it by what it produces. Chesterton is applying this exact same standard to human history.
Because the secular professors were looking at a tiny fragment of a jawbone and deducing an entire society of terror and wife-beating.
They were judging the tree by a theory about its roots, and Chesterton vehemently rejects that methodology.
He says, let's look at the actual tangible fruit left behind, the cave paintings.
Which shows a mind capable of creativity and quiet observation. He refuses to let theoretical evolutionary bias overwrite the tangible reality of the art.
So he is practicing intellectual fruitfulness. True discipleship deals in the reality of what is produced, not just what is theorized in a vacuum.
Absolutely.
And this leads us to another core instruction, total devotion to God's kingdom. Jesus demands absolute allegiance, right? You can't serve God and wealth.
Right. And we see Chesterton exploring this concept of singular devotion in his analysis of the Jewish people, but later in the text.
Yeah, he surveys these vast, sweeping, polytheistic empires of antiquity.
He looks at Babylon with its massive ziggurats and astrology, and Egypt with its obsession with the dead and animal-headed gods.
And amidst all this crushing imperial polytheism, he highlights this small nomadic tribe.
Israel. He calls their theology an almost monomaniac monotheism.
Monomaniac monotheism. That captures a fierce, almost terrifying loyalty.
It was terrifying to the empires around them. The Israelites carried the idea of an invisible God. The surrounding nations had gods you could touch and carry into battle.
Statues of gold and stone.
But Israel had a God who expressly forbade any physical representation. Furthermore, Chesterton points out that this nomadic tribe possessed the profound philosophy of the Book of Job,
which explores the deepest questions of human suffering and divine sovereignty.
It's a towering work of philosophical literature, and Chesterton notes it was kept completely separate from the mythologies of the surrounding pagans.
They didn't blend their theology with the local Canaanite fertility cults.
Not without fierce condemnation from their prophets, anyway. Their entire national identity was built on this refusal to compromise.
And this is where we see total devotion modeled. By refusing to make physical idols, they preserve the spiritual reality of a jealous God.
A God who requires your whole heart, soul, and strength. They paved the way for the Christian understanding that the kingdom of God demands everything.
You can't just offer a pinch of incense to the local pagan deity to make business run smoother.
Exactly. And that refusal to compromise is exactly what Chesterton is doing in his own time.
To understand why he's fighting so fiercely, we really have to look at the battlefield he was standing on in the 1920s.
He's engaging in a massive cultural war against specific ideologies, mainly people like H.G. Wells and the materialist evolutionary historians.
Let's define materialism here, because it's not about wanting a fast car.
No. In this context, materialism is the philosophical belief that physical matter is the only reality. No spiritual realm, no soul.
Therefore, all of human history has to be explained purely by physical causes, like biology or economics.
Right, so if a nation goes to war, a materialist historian says it's entirely because they needed a warm water port for trade.
They completely discount the idea that men might march into battle for an ideal or religious conviction or to save their souls.
They strip the human spirit out of history. H.G. Wells popularized this narrative called the old man theory.
Oh, right. This idea that the first human societies were basically brutal herds, ruled by a terrifying alpha male.
The old man, who controlled all the resources and ruled through brute force until the younger men banded together, killed him, and formed a primitive democracy.
It sounds plausible if you only view humans as slightly advanced chimpanzees. But Chesterton completely dismantles it.
Because there is absolutely zero historical proof for this old man. It's just a projection of modern cynical assumptions backward into time.
And he uses the massive civilizations of antiquity to prove his point about how human power actually works.
Right, because secular academics assumed absolute tyranny must come at the beginning of human history, because early humans were assumed to be more barbaric.
But Chesterton looks at Egypt and Babylon and argues that crushing despotism usually comes at the end of a civilization's development. This is such a fascinating mechanism. Why does tyranny happen at the end?
Because early human survival requires immense cooperation and shared risk. A primitive tribe surviving the Ice Age can't afford to be ruled by a selfish tyrant.
They have to share resources and work together.
Exactly. It's a community of necessity. But fast forward a few thousand years. A society becomes wealthy, sprawling, and complex.
Massive infrastructure, trade networks.
And eventually, that society becomes exhausted. The bureaucracy gets too heavy. The population becomes fatigued, seeking comfort and safety over liberty.
So in that state of exhaustion, people winningly surrender their freedom to a strong man, a pharaoh or a Caesar, just to keep the aqueducts running.
As Chesterton brilliantly observes, a despotism is often just a tired democracy.
Wow. He's really defending the fundamental dignity of early humanity against the arrogance of modern academics.
He refuses to let that dry, robotic view strip away our ancestors' humanity.
And to bring that humanity to life, he uses this delightful historical theory about Egyptian hieroglyphs.
This is a perfect example of his method. Academics portrayed ancient peoples as these stiff, frightened automatons.
Right, analyzing hieroglyphs as this ponderous, gloomy, rigidly formal system.
But Chesterton suggests the complex art of writing might have actually begun as a joke.
Like ancient Egyptian priests trying to send a message about collecting taxes up the Nile.
Yeah. We'll say the spoken word for taxes sounded like the word for pig. So the priest, feeling cheeky, draws a picture of a pig as a bad pun.
Knowing his colleague will get the joke.
He compares it to a modern person drawing a hat. And then the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4 to mean at once, hat once, at once.
It's hilarious and deeply humanizing. It reminds us that ancient people were people. They laughed, made puns, got bored.
They weren't just biological machines. Chesterton is fighting the idol of scientism, the leap from saying science can explain the physical world to saying science can explain the human soul and humor.
And he brings this exact same fierce critique to the academic field of comparative religion.
Which is a massive trend then, to blur the lines between all faiths, lumping Jesus in with Buddha, Confucius, Mithras.
Treating them all as minor variations of the exact same evolutionary spiritual impulse.
Chesterton recognizes that if Christianity is just one flavor of a generic religious instinct, it loses its absolute claim to truth.
So he invents this satirical new discipline called comparative nomadics.
I love this. He says, imagine a professor writing a book on nomadic nations.
Groups of people who travel.
Right. First, he lists the Jews, historically accurate, then the Gypsies, also accurate.
But then he needs to fill out the book, so he stretches the definition.
He adds wandering English clerks, restless Irish immigrants, German waiters working abroad.
And finally, he includes the entire French army because they marched to Moscow under Napoleon.
It perfectly exposes the logical error. By stretching the definition of a category until it includes everything, the category loses all meaning.
Calling Confucianism a religion in the exact same way Christianity is a religion is a massive category error.
Because one is a brilliant system of social philosophy and the other is a revelation, the claim that the creator of the universe became a localized historical person.
Lumping them together is as absurd as lumping the French army and the Gypsies together as nomads.
He is fighting tooth and nail for the unique reality of the Christian claim.
Okay, so we've established he's a brilliant defender of the faith. His logic cuts through the fog. But this is where we have to put on our hats as mentors using the master instruction source.
Right, we have to ask the difficult question.
Does his execution ever drift away from the way of Jesus? Because when I read this, I notice a tone that feels very different from the Sermon on the Mount.
It's a necessary observation. We must identify the tension between his rhetorical style and Jesus' instructions, specifically the law of love and humility and service.
Because Jesus explicitly commands us to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us.
And Chesterton's tone is anything but gentle. He uses heavy, biting irony. Devastating sarcasm.
He borders on outright mockery. He calls the secular anthropologists illiterate hecklers.
He describes their suggestions as vapid and vacant. He paints them as desperate, foolish men trying to build a whole history from a piece of skull.
While his defense of truth aligns with total devotion, his combative tone can easily cross into intellectual pride.
We have to understand, he was a creature of Fleet Street in the 1920s. Pub debates, cigar smoke, intellectual brawling.
Verbal sparring was national entertainment.
But the tools of the Fleet Street rhetorician are not necessarily the tools of the humble servant Christ called us to be.
Right, like when he describes the ill-educated Christian turning into the ill-tempered agnostic, it doesn't feel like a heartbroken observation of a soul losing its way.
It feels like a sick burn in a debate, scoring points for the audience.
Which stands in stark contrast to secret obedience, where Jesus tells us to seek the approval of God, not the applause of the crowd.
This raises a critical, practical question for the listener today. We live in an era of intense online debate and tribalism.
How do we reconcile this? Is it possible to dismantle a secular argument brilliantly without violating the law of love?
It makes me think about the difference between using a sword to defend someone and using a heavy wooden club just to prove you can swing it harder than the other guy.
I struggle with this myself. It is so deeply satisfying to win an argument online to expose a logical flaw.
But you have to ask, am I trying to win an argument and look smart, or am I trying to win a soul and reveal the character of Christ?
That is the essential discernment. Are you bearing witness to a person or defending a theory to protect your ego?
We should absolutely adopt Chesterton's intellectual clarity and demand for evidence, but we must consciously reject the combative pride.
We have to deploy his arguments with the compassion of Christ. And this need for discernment applies to how he views the ancient pagan world too.
Let's transition into that. Chesterton breaks down ancient paganism into 4 fascinating categories: God, the gods, the demons, and the philosophers.
Let's start with the first one, God.
Chesterton argues, contrary to the evolutionary model, that the original baseline belief of primitive man was actually monotheism.
The belief in the Great Spirit, or Atahoken.
Right. If you look at the most primitive tribes, they almost universally possess a deep, assumed belief in a single high God who made everything.
A Sky Father. But this God is often viewed as somewhat distant, right?
Yes, assumed to be there, but not constantly appeased with daily rituals. The revolutionary argument here is that pure monotheism did not slowly evolve out of polytheism as humans got smarter.
Rather, polytheism was a corruption that grew over the original truth.
Like thick vines growing over an ancient stone ruin, the original human impulse was toward one creator.
Then you have the second category, the gods, the mythology, the daydream of humanity, he calls it.
And he's actually quite sympathetic toward this. He sees the sweeping myths of the Greeks and Romans as humanity's imaginative, poetic attempt to reach out to the divine.
It's an expression of the human need to worship. He acknowledges its beauty as art.
But he also identifies its flaw. It lacks moral weight. The Greek gods were powerful, but they weren't good. They lied and cheated.
So the mythology was a sincere poetic expression, but completely insufficient as a moral foundation.
Exactly. But then the framework takes a very dark turn.
The third category is the demons. If mythology is the daydream, demon worship is the nightmare.
This is a chilling historical analysis. He links the darkest forms of demon worship not to uneducated tribes, but to highly advanced literate civilizations.
Specifically Carthage, right? This wealthy, powerful maritime trading empire in North Africa.
Yes, Carthage is famous for its worship of Moloch.
They constructed these massive, hollow bronze statues with outstretched arms, heated by a raging fire from within.
And in times of crisis, they literally sacrificed their own infant children by placing them into the burning arms of the statue.
We really have to ask why an advanced society would do something so horrific.
Chesterton points out they didn't do it because they were stupid. They did it because they were aggressively practical.
They were businessmen and politicians who wanted immediate, guaranteed results.
Victory in war. Commercial success. Demon worship is the ultimate dark shortcut.
It's built on the logic that if you do something sufficiently low, ugly, and unnatural, the dark spiritual powers will be compelled to deliver the goods.
It's a transaction.
That analysis is deeply unsettling because it feels like a chilling parallel to our modern world.
It really does.
We don't build bronze statues of Moloch, obviously, but the idea that extreme efficiency and worldly success demand a human sacrifice is still very much alive.
How often does the pursuit of corporate dominance or personal ambition require us to sacrifice our families, our morality, or the vulnerable on the altar of practical results?
When a society values efficiency over human dignity, it is walking the path of Carthage.
Now, Chesterton presents his fourth category, the philosophers, thinkers like Socrates or Marcus Aurelius.
Who saw through the myths and the horror of the demons, but couldn't quite reach the reality of a personal, loving God.
They sought truth through reason, and this is where we have to exercise our mentorship and discernment again.
Because when Chesterton discusses Eastern philosophies here, particularly Buddhism, he is incredibly dismissive.
He essentially reduces Buddhism to a philosophy indistinguishable from despair, a desire to just escape existence and melt into a void.
We really have to guide the listener to separate the wheat from the chaff here.
We can value Chesterton's core insight, that the human soul has an original capacity for the one true God that gets corrupted.
And we can accept his thesis that Jesus is unique. But we do not have to adopt his early 20th century Western biases and caricatures.
He was writing in 1925. He didn't have the benefit of modern interfaith dialogue or nuanced translations of Eastern texts.
He was viewing the East through the somewhat condescending lens of the British Empire.
Exactly. As modern disciples, we can hold fast to total devotion to Christ without having to mock the deeply held spiritual traditions of billions of people.
We can disagree with Buddhist theology while recognizing the profound moral discipline and search for peace in their practice.
But even with those cultural biases, his poetic insight into the overall mood of the ancient pagan world is absolutely staggering.
Yeah, he describes the fundamental emotional baseline of antiquity. He says it's not exactly the presence of a false god, it's the presence of the absence of God.
It's a haunting phrase. He compares reading ancient literature to looking at an empty chair at a dinner table.
You don't just see empty space, you see the specific, aching absence of a friend who is supposed to be there.
He argues you can feel this ache in Homer and Virgil. He makes the bold claim that there was never a man in antiquity who was genuinely happy in the way St. Francis of Assisi was happy.
The pagans had bravery and stoic endurance, but they lived with a void, wandering in a beautiful but ultimately empty daydream.
And this realization, the exhaustion of the pagan world, brings us to our final section, modern discipleship translation.
What does all of this ancient history, this analysis of Carthage and cavemen, actually mean for you, the listener, today?
How does this challenge the way a believer thinks, scrolls through their phone, and follows Christ in the 21st century?
Let's look at how Chesterton describes the Roman Empire right before Christianity exploded onto the scene.
He calls late Rome a place of stale and sterile universality.
Stale and sterile universality, meaning they had conquered the known world, pooled all the wealth and philosophies, and yet society was spiritually bankrupt.
Yes, they created this interconnected world where every myth and local religion was tolerated. The Roman pantheon was literally a temple to all gods.
You could worship Isis, Jupiter, or tree spirits, and the Roman state didn't care.
As long as you also tossed a little pinch of incense on the altar to the emperor to prove your political loyalty.
Religion was just a private lifestyle choice, a convenient, exhausted, cynical compromise.
No one believed any of it was absolute truth. And then into this exhausted, hyper-tolerant empire, the Christians arrived.
And they didn't just bring another poetic myth, they brought a staggering historical claim.
That the invisible creator God had literally, physically entered human history, died on a cross, and risen from the dead.
And most shockingly to the Roman mind, they operated with what Chesterton calls an unnatural joy.
They weren't burdened by the unfathomable sadness of the pagans. They were terrifyingly happy, even facing persecution.
And that joy, coupled with their absolute refusal to burn even a single grain of incense to the emperor, provoked a violent reaction.
The halo of hatred around the Church of God. The tolerant empire suddenly became viciously intolerant of this one specific group.
The translation to our modern world is almost painfully direct.
We live in a 21st century secularized, globalized internet culture that perfectly mirrors that Roman sterile universality.
Endless information, constant global connection, a culture that tolerates almost any spiritual belief system or lifestyle.
But there is a catch. It is tolerated, provided it remains a private, subjective lifestyle choice.
Right. The modern world says you can believe whatever you want, just don't tell me your truth, makes an absolute claim on reality or on my life.
The modern pantheon is the internet feed where a human tragedy is sandwiched between a cat meme and a shoe ad.
It flattens all truth into mere content.
The modern believer is challenged to live in this cynical environment with that exact same unnatural joy and radical self-denial that shocked the Roman world.
Self-denial isn't just about giving up chocolate for Lent. In this context, it's about publicly refusing to bow to the idols of the age.
Whether that idol is consumerism or the relentless pursuit of online approval.
Okay, let's get incredibly practical for the listener. Think about your life this week. Are you letting the secular world dictate your history?
Are you absorbing the narrative that you are just a highly evolved animal driven by biological impulses?
Or do you see yourself as the man in the cave, a miraculous creation made in the image of God?
The world wants to tell you your faith is just an evolutionary coping mechanism, no different than the myths of antiquity.
But Chesterton gives you the intellectual permission, backed by evidence, to say no. The evidence of our art and our spiritual hunger points directly to a creator.
Here's a specific practice for your discipleship this week. Evaluate your faith by the instruction of fruitfulness.
Don't judge your discipleship by the theological theories in your head or the debates you win online. Judge it by the tangible fruit of your actions.
What are you actually producing in your home? What is the fruit of your presence in your workplace? Is it joy, peace, patience, or anxiety and pride?
And when you are inevitably forced to engage with skeptics, the modern, cynical online hecklers, how do you conduct yourself?
Are you relying on the heavy, blunt club of sarcasm and mockery to win a fleeting culture war?
Or are you operating strictly under the law of love, seeking to serve, illuminate, and bear witness?
We must adopt Chesterton's brilliant clarity and courage without adopting his combative pride.
It requires deep humility and service. We aren't defending a theoretical philosophy. We are bearing witness to a living person.
The ancient pagan world had brilliant philosophers and beautiful myths, but it ended in despair because it lacked a loving God who actually enters human history to save it.
So to circle all the way back to where we started, standing too close to that familiar painting and stepping back to see the giant on the hillside.
And stepping into the pitch-black prehistoric cave to find the sweeping, vivid signature of humanity on the walls.
Chesterton beautifully proves that art is the signature of man. It distinguishes humanity from the beasts wandering in the evolutionary twilight.
But if art is the signature of man, distinguishing him from the beasts, then according to the master instruction source leaves, Jesus himself love is the signature of the disciple.
Distinguishing him from the world. Jesus said, "By this everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another."
We must not only remember that we are uniquely human, we must remember whose we are.
We are called to an unnatural joy amidst a cynical world, total devotion amidst modern idols, and a radical sacrificial love.
So the question to leave you with today is this. When people look at the cave walls of your daily life, your calendar, your bank statements, the way you speak to your enemies online, what signature are you leaving behind?
Are you just surviving the twilight, or are you drawing in the daylight?
That is the ultimate standard. That is the master instruction source applied to real life.
That's the heart of the section. This is discipleship for the present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.